Rain fell in steady sheets over Maplewood Estates, washing the streets into a gray blur. On most mornings, the cul-de-sac was quiet, the kind of place where lawns glistened with sprinklers and neighbors waved politely before ducking back into their perfectly curated lives. But today, the storm carried more than water. It carried judgment. Karen Mitchell, president of the HOA, walked briskly through the rain with an umbrella tilted like a crown. Clutched in her hand was a bright yellow envelope, the kind every homeowner in Maplewood dreaded. She reached Daniel Ward's porch, slipped it under his door, and smiled with satisfaction. $5,000, she muttered to herself. Maybe now he'll learn. The fine was for something petty, absurd even, the wrong shade of blue on his shutters. Not peeling paint, not structural damage, just a color she claimed violated the HOA's sacred aesthetic harmony. Within hours, whispers spread. Neighbors peeked from behind blinds, gossiping in hushed tones. Board members smirked at their victory, knowing Daniel had been singled out. On his porch, the yellow slip bled in the rain, its ink running like a public scarlet letter. It wasn't just money. It was humiliation. A warning shot meant to break him. But what they didn't know was that Daniel wasn't just another homeowner. Because behind that weathered door, behind those rain-soaked shutters, Daniel owned something far bigger than the HOA could ever control. And once they pushed him too far, they would all learn just how small their power really was. Daniel Ward lived simply. His neighbors saw him as the quiet man at the end of Birch Lane, the one who mowed his own lawn in faded jeans, wore the same scuffed leather boots year after year, and drove an old pickup that rattled when it turned the corner. He waved politely, but rarely lingered in conversation. His yard was tidy, but not immaculate. His shutters plain, his clothes ordinary. To most, he looked like a man just getting by. He rose early, brewed cheap coffee, and read the morning paper at his kitchen table. At night, the glow from his living room lamp often flickered long after the neighborhood had gone to sleep. Some assumed he was a worrier, maybe staying up late to balance bills or write checks for fines he couldn't afford. More than once, Karen's circle whispered, "He's probably drowning in debt." But inside Daniel's home, subtle details told a different story. His desk bore neatly stacked financial reports, thick binders stamped with names of regional banks. His phone buzzed late into the night with quiet conversations, his tone calm, professional, decisive. The words he used weren't those of a man pleading with creditors. They were the words of a man who made decisions, who approved numbers, who signed off on loans. He never flaunted it, never hinted at what he truly was. But sometimes, in passing, he would glance at the sign of the local credit union with a look that seemed almost proprietary, like a craftsman appraising his own work. To the neighbors, Daniel was just another man with weathered shutters and a battered truck. But behind the modest clothes and quiet routines lay a truth waiting to surface. Daniel Ward wasn't struggling to pay his mortgage. Daniel Ward was the mortgage. And the moment Karen pushed him too far, that truth would turn Maplewood Estates upside down. The community center smelled faintly of disinfectant and stale coffee. Folding chairs lined the floor, filled with neighbors who had come more for the spectacle than the agenda. At the front, under harsh fluorescent lights, the HOA board sat behind a long table like a tribunal. At its center, Karen presided with her usual smirk, her gavel ready to pound. Daniel sat quietly in the back row, a simple notebook, balanced on his knee. His shirt was plain, his posture unassuming. To the crowd, he looked out of place, a man walking into a lion's den with nothing but paper and a pen. Karen called his name, her voice thick with condescension. "Mr. Ward, regarding your unpaid violation for non-compliant shutters." She held up the yellow notice as if it were evidence in a trial. $5,000, due in 30 days. A board member leaned toward the microphone, his voice dripping with mockery. "Maybe if you drove a newer truck, you'd take more pride in your house." Laughter rippled through the room. Another chimed in. "If you can't afford paint, Mr. Ward, perhaps you should reconsider whether you belong in this neighborhood at all." The crowd chuckled again, their amusement feeding off the cruelty. Karen leaned forward, her smile sharpened. "Failure to comply will result in additional fines. And yes, foreclosure proceedings are on the table if necessary." Gasps and murmurs spread. Some neighbors nodded grimly, satisfied that order was being upheld. Others shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Through it all, Daniel didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't defend himself. His pen moved steadily across the page, recording each insult, each threat, each laugh at his expense. Karen slammed the gavel once. "Do you have anything to say for yourself, Mr. Ward?" Daniel looked up, meeting her eyes for the briefest moment. His expression was calm, unreadable, almost unnervingly so. Then he lowered his gaze back to his notebook, closed it gently, and said only 2 words. "Not yet." The room quieted, puzzled, waiting for the outburst that never came. Daniel stood, gathered his things, and walked out with the same quiet dignity he had walked in with, leaving behind a tension that no amount of laughter could fully disguise. That night, the rain had stopped, leaving streets glistening like sheets of glass. Inside his quiet kitchen, Daniel sat alone at the table, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the house. A single lamp cast its low over scattered notes, the yellow fine notice, and a worn leather wallet. From the wallet, he pulled out an old photograph. The edges were frayed, the colors faded. It was of his father, tall, proud, dressed in a banker's suit from another era. The man's smile was faint, but his eyes carried the same calm Daniel wore now. Daniel traced the edges of the photo with his thumb, his mind drifting back to late nights at that same table years ago. He remembered the way his father would sit with him, patient and firm, teaching him numbers, contracts, the power that comes not from shouting, but from knowing. His father's voice echoed in memory, steady and deep. "Real power doesn't shout, son. It waits. It lets others exhaust themselves. And when the moment comes, it doesn't need to raise its voice. The truth speaks for itself." Daniel closed his eyes, the words anchoring him. The insults from the meeting, the laughter, the threats of foreclosure, they no longer stung. They were noise, temporary. He set the photo gently beside his notebook, flipped it open, and began writing again. His pen moved with quiet certainty, each line a step toward something larger, something the board could never anticipate. He wasn't silent because he was powerless. He was silent because he was waiting. And when the moment came, Maplewood Estates would discover that Daniel Ward was far more than the man they mocked. The morning after the stormy HOA meeting, Daniel dressed as he always did. Plain slacks, a simple jacket, nothing to mark him as extraordinary. To any neighbor watching, it was just another errand, another quiet day. He parked his rattling truck outside the local credit union and stepped through the glass doors. But inside, everything changed. The moment Daniel entered, the staff straightened. A teller stopped mid-sentence, her tone softening as she smiled. "Good morning, Mr. Hayes." Another, a manager in a crisp suit, hurried forward. "Always a pleasure, sir. Would you like your usual conference room?" The name hung in the air like a spark. Mr. Hayes, not Ward, not the quiet man on Birch Lane. A name that carried weight, the kind that wasn't written on overdue bills but on ownership documents and stock certificates. Daniel nodded politely, his expression calm, almost detached. He followed the manager past velvet ropes and curious customers, through a frosted glass door that led into a private conference room. Inside, the table gleamed, polished to perfection. Folders were already waiting, lined with bank seals and ledgers. He sat down, flipping one open. The numbers inside weren't the worries of a man juggling late payments. They were the ledgers of someone who owned the very system others begged from. Because Daniel Hayes, the man his neighbors knew only as Daniel Ward, held controlling shares in this regional bank. And this bank, quietly and efficiently, managed not only the neighborhood's mortgages, but the HOA's accounts, loans, and credit lines. The same people who mocked him for shutters, who threatened foreclosure, who laughed at his truck. All of them were, in ways they didn't even realize, operating on the balance sheets that Daniel signed off on. He closed the folder slowly, his lips curling into the faintest shadow of a smile. The board thought they had fined him, humiliated him, pressed him into silence. But Daniel's silence had only been patience. Now the waiting was over. The conference room was silent but for the soft shuffle of papers. Daniel leaned over the polished oak table, flipping through thick binders and printouts. Every page carried the weight of secrets hidden in plain sight. The HOA's financial records were stored right here, managed under the same bank where Daniel held controlling power. What the board thought was secure, private, and untouchable now sat before the man they had mocked as powerless. He traced a column of numbers with his finger. At first glance, it looked ordinary. Community facile. Ease, maintenance expenses, landscaping contracts. But Daniel had spent a lifetime reading balance sheets. He knew when numbers were lying. There, a landscaping bill doubled in size without explanation. A maintenance fund drained into vague consulting fees. Credit cards issued in the HOA's name, swiped at restaurants and boutiques far from Maplewood Estates. Even fuel receipts, charged repeatedly, though no HOA vehicles existed. And then the bigger truth, hidden debts. Loans quietly taken under the HOA's name, masked behind small print and shifting accounts. The board had been borrowing against residents' fees to cover their indulgences, disguising financial ruin as solvency. Daniel's jaw tightened. These weren't just violations of trust. They were crimes dressed as bylaws. The same people who mocked his truck, who threatened foreclosure over shutter paint, were siphoning money from the very neighbors they claimed to protect. With quiet precision, he gathered the evidence. Each document slid into his folder like a nail being hammered into the board's coffin. He made no grand gestures, no speeches, just methodical preparation, the patience his father had taught him. Real power doesn't shout. It waits. He closed the binder, the weight of it final, almost ceremonial. The board thought they held the high ground, wielding fines like weapons. But beneath their empire of letters and threats was a house of cards, ready to collapse with a single push. Daniel tucked the folder under his arm, rose from the chair, and walked out of the bank. His boots echoed down the marble floor, steady, deliberate. The neighbors had laughed at him. The board had mocked him, but none of them knew the truth that now rested in his hands. He wasn't just going to fight their fine. He was going to dismantle their entire kingdom. And when the collapse came, it wouldn't be quiet. It would be here, in every house on every street of Maplewood Estates. The next HOA meeting was packed. Word had spread about Daniel's defiance, and curious neighbors filled every folding chair, lining the walls, eager for another show. At the front, the board sat smugly, gavel polished, papers stacked like ammunition. Karen leaned into her microphone, her smile dripping with anticipation. "Mr. Ward," she said, drawing out the name, "you are now 30 days delinquent on your fine, $5,000. Do you have the funds, Or should we begin discussing foreclosure? Laughter flickered through the room. A few neighbors shook their heads, pitying him, but most waited to see him squirm. Daniel walked forward calmly, a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. He wore the same plain jacket, the same boots, his expression unreadable. He stopped in front of the board's table, set the folder down gently, and opened it with the same patience he had carried into battlefields of numbers. "I came here to settle accounts," he said softly. Karen smirked. "Then write the check." But Daniel didn't pull out a pen. He pulled out paper, documents, line after line of ledgers, contracts, receipts. He slid them across the table, his movements deliberate, almost surgical. The board members leaned forward, expecting compliance. Then their faces changed. One went pale. Another swallowed hard. Karen's smile cracked as her eyes scanned the lines. Unauthorized expenses, overdrawn accounts, misallocated funds. Every page was a mirror reflecting their greed back at them. Daniel's voice remained calm, his tone even. Thunder disguised as silence. "You fined me $5,000 for paint." He paused, his gaze steady. "But you've stolen hundreds of thousands from this community. Loans disguised as landscaping. HOA cards swiped for personal luxuries. And every dime," he tapped the folder once, "flows through accounts controlled by my bank." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Neighbors leaned in, murmurs turning into outrage. The laughter was gone. All that remained was silence so heavy it pressed dough, one on every seat in the room. Karen's lips trembled. You can't!" But Daniel cut her off with nothing more than a look. His calm was louder than her panic. "I don't need to raise my voice. The numbers speak louder than I ever could." He closed the folder slowly, the sound echoing like a gavel. The board, once smug, now sat frozen, their authority evaporating under the weight of undeniable truth. And for the first time, it wasn't Daniel under judgment. It was them. The man they mocked for old shutters and a rattling truck had just revealed himself as the storm they never saw coming. And Maplewood Estates would never be the same. The fallout was swift. Within days of Daniel's quiet thunder, the board crumbled. Members resigned under pressure, some escorted from the bank under investigation. Karen, once untouchable, vanished from the neighborhood she had ruled with fear. The HOA was dismantled and rebuilt from the ground up, this time with open books, transparent policies, and residents, not tyrants, at the helm. At the first meeting under the new leadership, Daniel stood once more before his neighbors. He carried a single envelope, simple and unremarkable. Without ceremony, he placed a check for $5,000 on the table. "I pay this," he said calmly, "not because I accept their judgment, but because I respect the principle that no one is above the rules." Gasps rippled through the crowd, but before they could settle, Daniel laid down a second envelope. Inside was a donation double the fine. $10,000 earmarked for a new playground, a community garden, and scholarships for neighborhood kids. "This was never about the money," he continued. "It was about fairness, about dignity, about making this place a home we can all be proud of." The room rose in applause. Neighbors who had once whispered in fear now clapped openly, some with tears in their eyes. For the first time in years, Maplewood Estates felt like a community again, not a kingdom ruled by pettiness and power. Daniel gathered his papers, nodded humbly, and walked out into the evening. No gavel, no shouts, just quiet justice. Because true power, as his father once said, doesn't shout. It waits. And when it arrives, it builds, stronger than any fence, brighter than any paint, lasting longer than fear. The sun dipped low over Maplewood Estates, washing the neighborhood in gold. On his porch, Daniel sat in his old chair, the same boots on his feet, the same coffee mug in his hand. Nothing about him had changed, and yet everything had. This time, when neighbors passed, they didn't whisper. They waved. Some stopped to chat, children tugging at their sleeves, laughter carrying down the street. The same people who once watched in silence now greeted him with the quiet respect reserved for someone who had fought not for himself, but for all of them. Inside his home, hanging neatly on the wall above his desk, was the bright yellow fine notice. The ink had blurred from rain, but the bold numbers still showed. $5,000. He had framed it, not as a scar, but as a reminder. A reminder of the moment when arrogance thought it had won, and how patience had quietly overturned it. Daniel leaned back, eyes settling on the photograph of his father that still sat on the desk. The voice came back to him, steady and timeless. Real power doesn't shout. It waits. The camera lingered on the fine notice, then pulled back to the porch, to the man who once seemed small and ordinary, but had revealed himself larger than the system that tried to break him. Daniel Ward. The man they underestimated, the man who owned more than a bank, had reminded them all that true power is not loud. It is patient, and when it arrives, it changes everything.